Today I will be talking about Pema 2011 film Old Dog. The film follows a Tibetan farmer who, despite facing immense pressures from his family and community, refuses to sell his nomadic mastiff. The film is essentially a tug-of-war for the dog, as the mastiff breed has become very valuable in mainland China. As the demand for the mastiff continues to go up, the family must ultimately determine the dog's fate. Tseden uses the mastiff as a symbolic representation of the challenges faced by Tibetan culture, highlighting the complexities of tradition, modernity, and identity. Particularly, this vlog will focus on how Tseden's sound use helps to underscore these challenges, presenting the audience with the story open for interpretation. In general, Tibetan mastiffs are significantly linked to Tibetan culture as a whole. These large and intimidating dogs were originally bred to serve as guard dogs of livestock and families alike. They symbolize strength and loyalty, embodying the resilience of the Tibetan people. Tseden first employs the dog and various noises to establish a setting, exploring the changing Tibetan landscapes in the face of modernity. As opening credits roll, we first hear the rattle of a motorcycle before the camera opens from its black screen to a man riding the bike. The signature mastiff follows behind, chained to the bike. We start to hear the dog panting, blended together with mechanical sounds of the motor and the clanking of the chain. This intricate use of sound alludes to larger issues going on in Tibet. China and their occupation of Tibet has made significant strides to modernize the area, improving the infrastructure and bringing economic growth to Tibet. However, this progress has threatened the traditional Tibetan lifestyle, as cultural assimilation has diluted the Tibetan identity. The panting dog represents Tibet and the motorcycle represents China, while the clanking chain symbolizes the power dynamic which restricts Tibetan autonomy. Tseden used these contrasting sounds to signify a certain powerlessness that Tibetans feel from their Chinese occupiers. Tseden, however, does not use such sounds to imply that it is simply tradition versus modernity, but employs something more complex. Tibetans are willing to adapt to changes, especially positive ones brought about by modernity, but they have no say in what happens to them. Tseden continues to use the dog and sound to build on this point. Shortly after the opening scene, we see Gampo, the man on the bike and the main character, stop to play snooker outside of the police station. Once again, the mastiff pants heavily in the background as pool balls crack together and cars loudly drive down the street. Gampo is actively seeking out the pleasures of modernity, as pool signifies the leisure which a market economy brings. He is willing to adapt to changing systems, but the dog's panting in the backdrop reminds us of the lack of control that Tibetans face in the evolution of China's occupation in Tibet. Tseden effectively blends in silence to emphasize important moments within the film, allowing the audience time to contemplate the scene's meaning. In one scene, Gampo stands next to a truck of mastiffs as they are being taken to mainland China. Once again, we hear the motor of a truck contrasted with the dogs barking. However, the significance of the scene is the silence, as the motor and dogs fade away as the truck drives off. Gampo follows the truck for a while before returning back to his original spot. A traditional Tibetan song plays in the background, but Gampo says nothing. His following of the truck might indicate a yearning for choice, as he wants to save the dogs, but can do nothing. Gampo's silence once more suggests that Tibetans have lost their voice, wanting to be involved but helpless to larger forces. Another effective use of silence happens at Gampo's home as he, his girlfriend, and his father watch the television. A typical infomercial plays on the screen, marketing some type of cheap jewelry. The trio sits in silence, eyes glued to the television. The infomercial is a sign of the changing ideals in Tibet, as the market economy has replaced their traditional sheep herding lifestyle. While brief, their silence resonates loudly with the audience, further ingraining the idea that their identity is being assimilated into larger notions of Chinese culture. Silence then becomes a form of resistance towards the end of the film. In a later scene, Gampo's father sits with a mastiff behind him, watching over the sheep. Two men approach on a motorcycle and end up offering to buy the mastiff. The father denies all offers, simply saying no or not selling. Finally, as the last offer goes up to $20,000, the father simply turns away and looks into the countryside. These two Chinese men leave, and the father is left sitting there with the dog. We are left with a long scene of the father guiding the dog and the sheep, left to the baas of the sheep, the wisp of the wind, the sway of the grass, and the flying of insects. This traditional Tibetan landscape, along with the father's unwillingness to sell, symbolizes Tibetan resistance to Chinese rule. It may suggest Tibet's desire for self-autonomy and preservation of culture, but Tseden uses a long take blended with sound to allow the audience to interpret it in their own way. The finale sees the father hang the dog by a fence, ending its life. The death is not shown on screen, but the dog growls and whines as its time comes to an end. Here, sound is effective in portraying the gruesome nature of the dog's death. The brutal and primal sounds may allude to the fighting spirit of Tibet, as the dog's attempts to stay alive mirror Tibet's relationship with China. However, the ending is not that simple, as the Tibetan is the one taking the dog's life, not the Chinese. It acts as a method of resistance, as the father actively chooses to kill the dog. The father killing the dog rather than the son is significant as well, as it may suggest that the future of Tibet lies in the past rather than the future. Although faced with inevitable daunting power of China and the changes of modernity, Tibetans assert that a comfortable lifestyle cannot buy or replace the Tibetan soul and culture. Old Dog leaves its message up for interpretation. Its blend of sound and symbolism of the Mastiff explores the ever-changing nature of Tibetan society in the face of China's occupation. While fairly open-ended, the film poses important questions about representation and what it means to be Tibetan.